Hi, today I'm showing you how to play against the boring London system in an exciting and combative way. So let's get started. So this is what the London looks like. What gives it its boring reputation? Well, it's got this triangle pawn structure, which is very solid and hard to break down despite black's space. Also, white has the e5 square very well defended, and this means that even though black puts a lot of pressure on e5, black's not really able to break through so easily, so it leads to a lot of boring play. My anti-London system is trying to either deprive white of the e5 square or trying to deprive white of the triangle formation that most players are used to. So how to get started? Well, if they play d4 trying to go into the London and you play d5, I'm going to recommend you switch to knight f6. You can still get your d5 structures, or even if you're a Slav player, you can still get your Slav structures via a different move order. So knight f6 is just a more flexible way to play. And the purpose here is after bishop f4, the beginning of the London, you play c5 instead of d5, and this is the first move in my anti-London system. So in this exact position, white has 5 options, really. There's knight f3, there's takes, there's push, there's push, there's push. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. I'm going to try to go through each of them very briefly and show you the general plans. Okay, so the first one to show you is knight f3, seemingly defending the pawn well, but if black takes the pawn, white simply doesn't have a good way to take back. If you take back with the knight, your pieces get forked. And if your bishop takes this pawn, your pieces get forked. One way or another, black is winning material. So what happens if the queen takes back instead? Well, if the queen takes back, we want the same e5 idea. We prep it with d6, and when the queen leaves, we get e5, and when the bishop leaves, you see we have a big pawn center already. Now we just need to put the pieces behind them. Most of black's problems are resolved, and white doesn't get the triangle they wanted, nor do they get the e5 square, and black can just kind of develop behind this. I'll show you what development looks like very briefly. The bishops will go here, the knight will go here, and then black will castle. So let's put some moves on the board. Something like this, basically. And if you're aware of how the Najdorf is played, this looks a lot like a Najdorf, and some of the middle game ideas are going to resemble how you play the Sicilian Najdorf. So some of the strategical ideas are that basically black gets this open C file and it's going to try to create targets on this file. So the queen goes to C7, one of the rooks comes to C8, and you press that way. Another idea for black is that they play A6, B5 to get space. And the last idea for black is that if white tries to put a knight into D5, you let them. When they get that knight in, you take with the bishop. And when you take back like this, still black should get a good game with lots of chances. For example, pressing e4 is sometimes a tactic, and even when it's not, it's sometimes a good move. Pressure on the c file is good. Ultimately, this is a middle game. You've gotten out of the opening. So what if white tries maybe just taking the pawn altogether? You go knight a6, attacking the pawn back, and white doesn't have really... Like, if white just develops and you take on c5, your knight is well developed on the c5 square. It's not so easy to kick it away because you just get the e4 square and your knight is further developed. So white doesn't really want to play b4. Instead, what you'll expect to see is just normal development from white. Let's say they go here, and as black, you have the same idea as before. d6, e5, getting lots of space. Let me just put it on the board and show you what it'll look like. Again, the bishops will develop behind the pawns like this, and this is a very straightforward system. Again, you have the open C file, again, you have the expanding idea, and again, if this knight comes to D5, you take with the bishop. So this is now a middle game, and black should be able to come up with some middle game ideas here, and so for that reason, you don't really take. The last thing to look at if white chooses to take is what happens if white tries to hold on to the pawn. We go queen a5 with a fork here, and when white blocks the fork, we take with the queen, and same position, d6, e5 to get space. It's the only difference is there are no queens here, but this is still an exciting position. Lots to play for here. Okay, so I don't like knight f3. I don't like pawn takes c5. We've gone over both of those. Now let's go over the more solid moves. c3 is a very tricky way to play. The way that I think is best to play is takes on d4, takes on d4, and then you strike at both b2 and d4 like this. White can't so easily defend b2 without dropping the d4 square, and this is what makes it so tricky. But one of the things you have to watch out for as black is if white defends b2 like this, you can't go ahead and take the pawn. You're getting checkmated. So Whenever you try to go for this d4 pawn, make sure that if the white queen defends b2 and is on the c file at the same time, you first make the defensive move knight c6, blocking the queen's vision and getting further pressure on d4. When white finally defends d4 with something like this, we're going to play basically d6, e5. It's a little bit complicated, but let me put it all on the board. Again, white can't take, again, because we have this same tactic that we saw earlier, and this tactic features itself multiple times in this anti-London setup. So the bishop normally steps back, and we go e4 here. And this is now almost a middle game. These bishops have lots of squares to develop to. It's going to be up to you to find good squares, but black should actually have a small advantage here. So again, that idea is to go d6, e5, e4. And if you, as white, try to develop your queen to d2, holding on to this pawn, but without going onto the c file, your queen steps into striking range of this knight. And black can be better by basically attacking the queen, and when the queen attacks my knight, I simply don't care. If you take, I take on b2, getting the rook, and a rook's more valuable than a knight. So white doesn't really want to take, and the game will basically play itself. I can even go d5 here, because I'm so far developed as black. Basically bishop f5. I can play normal stuff, and what you really should be feeling here as black is that you're so much faster than white, because white's had to move their queen twice, and the queen is going to be hit a third time by this rook. And so this is how you might play as black against a queen d2. Now, the last thing to be aware of is the pawn sacrifice with knight c3. This is, according to the engine, the best way to play, and it's really hard for black to show an advantage, even though black is collecting a lot of pawns. The line that I like to play is taking on b2, and if they're a supercomputer, they go bishop d2 and defend like this, and I go back to b6 and I get pressure on the d4 pawn, and if they're a supercomputer, they go e4, and I take this d4 pawn, and actually white is slightly better, even though we've captured 2 pawns, but as a human, it's pretty hard to prove that white is slightly better. White will chase away this queen, and the queen will run around, and as black, it's your job to prove that you can hold on to the 2 extra pawns you've gotten. But, you know, most of us aren't supercomputers, and it actually is pretty hard to see this bishop d2, and it's pretty hard to see e4. And if white plays any other more passive way, then according to the engine, black gets an advantage because of the extra pawn that we took. So that just about covers this c3 move. The next move to go over is e3, and e3, just like c3, has its own flavor to it. We put pressure on the b2 pawn, and if white is good, white's going to go knight c3. This also works for knight a3. I can't take on b2 because basically this fork is too strong, and this is going to lead to a draw by perpetual. We want to do better than a draw. So I don't take on b2. I just fake it. I go d6, trying to hold the e5 square, and white will eventually watch this b2 pawn. I call that a wasted tempo. This is one of the things I'm trying to bait. And then here for black, the plan is pretty straightforward. I move these 3 pawns up 1 square. So bam, bam, and I've done it. And I develop my pieces behind. The bishop goes here, the knight goes here. Let me put some moves on the board for both sides, just something like this. And this is basically how you develop. The last little wrinkle is that the bishop is going to come to b7. That means this b7 pawn has to move. That means this queen has to move. Where does the queen go? According to the engine, the idea is queen c6. So the queen goes to c6. Let's waste some moves for white and show the setup. The pawn goes to b5 to give the b7 square, and the bishop comes to b7. And now we have checkmating ideas. If this knight moves too far, this is checkmate in 1, for example. And so black actually has some fighting ideas here. A couple positional ideas to keep track of. This d6 pawn, its job is to hold the e5 square, keeping the London pieces out of their natural e5, and this is annoying to play against as white. So when white takes here, we don't take with the d pawn, because taking with the d pawn would give up the e5 square. We take with the queen, or sometimes the knight, depending on the circumstance. In this case, the knight is better. That's thing number 1 to keep track of. Thing number 2 is that if white decides to start pushing with his 2 pawns like this, we can break up the center by taking one of those pawns. And so that's how you would play against the e3 variation here, if they go knight c3. And if they do really anything else, like queen c1 to defend here, then they're dropping the d4 pawn. It's actually pretty hard to hold on to everything as white. And so black already has a good deal of pressure here right out of the opening. So that's what to do against e3. The last and maybe most critical idea for white, I've saved the best for last, is to go d5. And if they go d5, they're definitely not getting a London structure. They don't get the triangle they want because their d pawn is too far and the pawn doesn't hold e5, so they're just not getting their London ideas. As a black player, this feels like a moral victory to me. I get what I want without having any effort. I could transpose into some normal Benoni type structure. This is possible, but the line I'm going to show for you guys today is the immediate b5. The white pieces normally watch the b5 square. And what I'm going for is getting b5 in while I have the opportunity. Let's say that white gets pressure on my b5 pawn. I go a6 to hold it, not a problem at all. And let's just say white develops, I develop. Let's say you develop. How is this dark squared bishop coming out? We go g6, bishop g7, and this is the basic setup. We have this nice pawn chain, which is giving us control over these dark squares, and the bishop is working along with that. And that's very nice. We're going to castle behind that, get some pressure on this diagonal, try to create play on the queen side. Okay, that being said, where do the rest of the pieces develop to? My favorite idea is to go bishop g4 and just trade this bishop off, because normally this light squared bishop doesn't get good squares, but sometimes you can go bishop b7. I don't like it as much as simply, let's say, trading this bishop off like this and like this. And even though I've given up the bishop pair, my knights will have a lot of space and activity. So I like playing like this. And after that, you're in the middle game. So hopefully I've covered all the lines here, the basic ideas in all of them. And this should just get you to a middle game where you can start playing, calculating. Some of these lines are going to be extremely sharp and tactical, but that's the point. The point is to bring the opponent out of their solid London and into attacking territory. So thanks for watching, and this is my first opening video. Leave some feedback in the comments and tell me if you like it and what openings to cover next. Thank you.